Hey guys, tonight we drifting somewhere far from the noise of history to a place just beyond the edge of memory. Somewhere in the soft folds of time, just beyond the bustling cities and grand philosophies, there lived a man no one remembered. His name was Bob Plato's cousin, perhaps, or perhaps just a quiet footnote in the margins of history. Tonight, we'll step gently into his world, where the air is thick with rosemary, the stones warm beneath bare feet, and the days drift by like clouds in a sleepy summer sky. The path to Bob's village was not one you could follow with a map. It was the kind of road that only reveals itself when you are not quite looking for it. Winding softly through hills brushed with golden grass, edged with groves of olive trees and ancient fig orchards, it meandered like a forgotten thought. Time moved slowly there, if it moved at all. Crickets played their violins in the distance, and the wind had long ago learned to whisper instead of howl. Travelers who came that way often didn't mean to. They were dreamers, wanderers, and the occasionally misplaced philosopher. Most turned back before they even reached the final bend. But if, by some gentle accident, you walked long enough, you might stumble into a place where the cobblestones were uneven but warm, and the rooftops curved like tired shoulders resting against the horizon. There, just before the earth sloped into a quiet valley, stood the village where Bob lived. It didn't have a name, or perhaps it had one once, but no one said it aloud anymore. The buildings were made of old stone, smoothed by wind and memory. Some walls leaned slightly inward, as if listening to each other, and vines curled along the shutters like they'd always belonged. Bob's house sat at the farthest edge of this village, beyond the last crooked lamp-post and a low stone archway covered in lichen. It wasn't a grand house, just a humble dwelling made of sun-bleached bricks, with a tiled roof that had settled over the years into a gentle slump. A wisteria vine trailed over the front, its blossoms hanging like tiny chandeliers, scenting the air with something sweet and vaguely wistful. It was the kind of home where no one knocked and no one hurried, a place where time forgot to keep count. Bob had lived there for, well, no one really knew how long. Long enough that the neighbors, if there were any left, had stopped wondering. He wasn't old in the way of crumbling bones or creaky joints, more like old in the way a riverbed is old, having carried many seasons through it without remembering each one. Some said he was a cousin of Plato, though what that meant had long since been lost in the folds of passing years. He never spoke of it. In fact, he didn't speak much at all. In the early hours, Bob could often be seen tending a small patch of thyme and lavender by the side of the house. He wore a long tunic the color of overcast skies and walked with a quiet rhythm, as if measuring time by the sound of his own footsteps. Occasionally, he paused to inspect a cracked flower pot or observe the way sunlight caught on a single spiderweb. Inside the house, the air was cool and still, carrying the scent of dried herbs and old paper. Light filtered in through thick glass windows in muted hues honeyed gold in the morning, soft rose in the evening. The floors were worn smooth by countless unhurried steps, and every shelf, every stone seemed to hum with the slow pulse of a life lived gently. But before we step through that wooden door, before we sit at the simple table or follow him into the sunlit garden, let us rest for a moment on the threshold. Here, in the hush between outside and in, it's easier to listen. Not for voices there aren't many, but for the sound of stillness itself. The soft settling of dust, the creak of the wood as it remembers, the breath of the wind curling around corners. This is where our story begins, not with a bang or a triumph, but with the quiet settling of the earth beneath bare feet, with a man no one remembers and a place time overlooks. And yet, in this small, unassuming corner of the world, there is something worth listening to. Not for its grandeur, but for its softness. Not for its fame, but for its peace. The days here do not demand attention. They arrive gently, like low clouds over the hills, and pass with a kind of reverence for stillness. Morning becomes afternoon not with bells or shouts, but with the lengthening of shadows and the shift in birdsong. And as the hours move, Bob moves with them, never ahead, never behind. He was not a philosopher by name, nor a teacher with students. His wisdom, if such a thing it could be called, was woven into his habits, into the way he folded his linens, the way he watched the sky, the way he placed a fig to ripen on the windowsill. Each act was quiet, ordinary, and full. Some said he was forgotten. Others said he had simply stepped out of the stories we choose to write down. But perhaps the truth is softer than either. Perhaps he lived the kind of life that didn't need remembering, because it had never truly been disturbed. So, as we begin this journey slowly, quietly, without urgency, let us take one last look down that forgotten path. The stones beneath our feet are warm. The air is rich with rosemary and the echo of old thoughts. Ahead lies a world without sharp edges, without loud answers. Only the hush of everyday rituals, the weight of small moments, and the gentle rhythm of a life unremarkable, and therefore deeply restful. Welcome, dear listener, to the world of Bob. Let the fire crackle softly beside you. Let the day fall away. And let us wander together into the quiet, where even time itself slows down just enough for sleep to find us. At the farthest edge of the village, where the road began to lose its shape and time sprouted between warm stones, stood Bob's house. It wasn't large, nor ornate. It had no columns or carvings, no painted tiles or marble steps. It simply existed, settled into the hillside as if it had always been there and always would be. Its walls were made of sun-faded stone, rough in places, smooth in others, each piece shaped not by chisels, but by time and touch. Moss lined the cracks like green threads stitching history together. In spring, tiny flowers peeked from between the stones, white and purple, dancing gently in the wind. The roof sagged softly at the center, like an old cat curling into sleep. Curved terracotta tiles layered across it, dulled by rain and sun into warm shades of clay and rust. Occasionally, a lizard would dart across them, quick and soundless, vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. The door was olive wood, faded to silver gray, its grain like slow-moving water. The hinges barely creaked, just a soft sigh when opened, as if the door, too, preferred stillness. Above it hung a small wind chime made of clay and string. It didn't ring often, only when the breeze was especially kind. When it did, it whispered rather than sang. A single front window looked out toward the lane, framed by pale green shutters, slightly uneven, always open. The glass was thick, old enough to bend the light, casting the world in a softened blur. Through it, the interior glowed with the amber hush of late afternoon. Inside, the house was cool and quiet, filled with the scent of lavender, dry earth, and old wood. Shadows lay gently on the stone floor, shifting slowly as the sun moved. The air held stillness, not the silence of emptiness, but the full-bodied quiet of a place long lived in, long listened to. Just to the left of the entrance stood a round wooden table, worn smooth by use and memory. It was not polished or grand, just simple, steady, and true. A ceramic ball sat at its center, filled with dried herbs, rosemary, fennel, sage. On the wall above, a shelf held a few utensils, a wooden cup, and a folded linen napkin. The kitchen was more of a corner, just a hearth, a few copper pots, and shelves holding jars of spices and tea leaves. Nothing fancy and nothing unnecessary. Each jar was labeled by hand with a slow, careful script: lemon balm, bay leaf, dried fig slices. The labels were fading, but still legible, still loved. A clay kettle rested on a stone ledge near the hearth. Its surface darkened from years of use, its handle wrapped in warm cloth. Bob would sometimes set it to warm, even when he had no plans to drink tea, just to fill the room with its quiet presence. Further in, past a short hallway, was the bedroom. It was small, just wide enough for a low bed tucked under a window. The frame was made of olive wood, sturdy and plain. The mattress, thin but soft, was covered in a linen sheet and a single wool blanket, neatly folded back. The pillow was flat and cool. There were no decorations, just a woven basket beside the bed, holding a few folded garments and a small bundle of dried mint. Another room, barely wider than the hallway, served as Bob's study. Shelves had been carved into the stone itself, holding scrolls, folded papers, and books with fraying covers. Some were in Greek, some in Latin, and some with no language at all, just drawings, circles, and lines. Bob didn't need to organize them. He knew where things were, even if no one else did. A stool rested beside a low writing table, worn smooth by his hands. An oil lamp stood nearby, its flame often left unlit, waiting. Sometimes Bob would sit here without writing, just thinking, or not thinking at all, only breathing, eyes resting on nothing in particular. The floor throughout the house was made of old wood, wide planks that creaked softly beneath bare feet. Not a sharp creak, but a quiet one like an old friend clearing their throat before speaking. Dust collected slowly here, not in a rush. It drifted lazily in beams of afternoon light, unhurried. The house didn't have much in the way of furniture, only what was needed. A single chair by the window, a hook for a cloak, a low stool beside the door. A broom leaned in one corner, bristles frayed but still useful. Everything had a purpose, even the quiet. There were no clocks, no mirrors, no paintings, no reminders of time passing or reflections of the self. The house seemed to exist outside of such things. Instead, it offered its own rhythm, measured not in hours, but in light and shadow, warmth and stillness. Sometimes in the late afternoon, Bob would light a small oil lamp near the shelf and sit beside it as the light grew dim. The lamp didn't flicker much. It burned slow and steady, casting soft amber curves on the stone walls. Outside, the breeze would rise and settle again, stirring the vines that framed the door. The house was not lonely. It simply didn't call attention to itself. Like Bob, it had long since made peace with being forgotten. It was content to hold what it held: warmth, rest, and the soft weight of a life lived gently. And when Bob moved through the house, he did so without noise. His footsteps were part of the house now, as much as the wood or the stone. He opened the window in the morning and closed it at dusk. He warmed the kettle even when no one was coming. He swept the floor even when it didn't need it. These were not chores. They were acts of presence, of noticing, of being in rhythm with the space he called home. In this quiet little house, far from the grand halls of Athens or the clamor of markets, Bob lived a life of gentle repetition. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he found joy in simplicity. There was no need to search for meaning when it had already made a home in the folds of daily life. Tomorrow, the kettle would warm again, the shutters would creak open, and Bob would step out into the morning light, just as he always did. But tonight, the house holds its breath in the soft hours before sleep. The lamp glows. The air rests. And we, too, are welcome to linger here a little longer, beside the worn table and the silent shelves. This is Bob's house. Quiet, steady, unremarkable, and deeply restful. Just beyond the back wall of Bob's quiet little house, where the stones gave way to soil, there stretched a small garden, a patch of earth, neither grand nor carefully sculpted, but full of the kind of calm that only slow tending can create. It wasn't enclosed by high walls or trimmed hedges. Instead, a low border of river stones curved gently around its edges, as if the garden had settled into the land rather than being placed upon it. The soil was dark and soft, sprinkled with broken terracotta, crushed shells, and the memory of composted herbs. It had been shaped, over many years, by Bob's hands dug, turned, and pressed into gentle furrows by fingers that moved without hurry. No two rows were straight. Nothing grew in perfect lines. But everything seemed to belong exactly where it was. Olive trees stood at the far side, their silver-green leaves whispering even when the air was still. Their trunks twisted in on themselves, like old dancers frozen mid-step. Some branches were heavy with fruit, others bare and resting. Beneath them, shadows fell in broken patterns on the ground, dappled and shifting, like thoughts passing through the mind of someone half asleep. Near the center of the garden grew a patch of wild thyme, its purple blossoms low and thick, humming softly with bees that moved slowly, as if even they had learned the art of unhurried labor. Beside it, a fig tree leaned toward the sun, its leaves broad and generous, casting shade like the pages of an open book. When the fruit came, it was not all at once. Just a fig here, another there, sweet and soft, and gone almost as soon as it ripened. There were herbs of every sort, not labeled, not sorted, just growing. Basil, mint, sage, oregano. Some had spilled over into the footpath and were gently stepped on, releasing their fragrance into the warm air. Bob never minded. He said, or rather once noted in the corner of a parchment, that a garden that doesn't to touch your steps, I send to much of a garden at all. He had built a small bench beneath the oldest olive tree, made from a single slab of stone laid across two broader ones. No backrest, no carvings, just stone, warmed by sun and cooled by evening. Bob often sat there in the late morning, a cup of herbal tea in his hand, eyes half closed, not quite meditating, not quite sleeping, simply existing. Sometimes he brought a notebook, but more often he left it behind. He didn't come to the garden to write. He came to listen not to voices or bird song, but to the space between sounds, the faint rustle of leaves, the pause between breezes, the quiet breath of a branch bending ever so slightly. He'd once scribbled a line half a line, really, that said, "Olives grow in silence, and so do thoughts worth keeping." A narrow path, marked only by where the grass refused to grow, wound through the plants. Bob had never mapped it, but his feet knew the way. Each step brought a small shift in perspective, a patch of marjoram there, a hidden snail trail here. The garden revealed itself, not all at once, but slowly, as if rewarding those who lingered. There were no fences. Only a soft border of taller plants where the garden gave way to the wild grasses, dandelions, lavender that had long since spread beyond its original spot. The bees followed it. So did Bob from time to time, with a small clay bowl in hand to gather a sprig or two, humming under his breath not a tune, but a kind of rhythm. Almost a silence made audible. In one corner, an old clay pot lay tipped on its side, half buried. Bob had planted nothing in it, but moss had claimed it, and a few stubborn marigolds had made their home at its mouth. It sat there, year after year, a little crooked, a little broken, entirely perfect. The garden didn't bloom all at once. It didn't try to impress. A few white blossoms might appear early in the season, soon joined by clusters of yellow and soft orange. Later, the sage would flower, then the basil, then nothing at all for weeks. The cycle was slow and unscheduled, and Bob followed it the same way he followed everything else, gently. He watered in the morning, not with a hose, but with a clay jar he dipped into the basin near the olive tree. The water fell slowly, and the plants never rushed to drink. He didn't measure. He didn't count. He simply watched the earth, waited for it to darken, and moved on. It was enough. When weeds came, he didn't pull them right away. Sometimes he let them grow for a while, just to see what they had to say. He believed, or seemed to believe, that everything tried to speak in its own quiet way, if given enough time. And time was something Bob had, Or maybe not more of it, just less need to chase it. The garden, like the house, asked for little. It did not demand. It didn't judge. It gave what it gave when it chose to. A handful of leaves for tea, a ripe fig, a branch of rosemary to hang above the window. In return, Bob gave attention and nothing more. The kind of attention that can only grow when everything else has gone still. Visitors were rare and almost never saw the garden. But if they had, they might have called it plain. They might have said it was overgrown or not well kept. They might have missed its quiet beauty, the way small things bloomed in corners where no one looked. But that wouldn't have bothered Bob. The garden wasn't meant to be admired. It was meant to be inhabited, walked through, sat beside, thought in. And thoughts did grow there, not bold ideas or arguments, but small understandings. Little questions that arrived like petals on the breeze. Why does lavender grow better near the fig tree? What makes some leaves curl while others spread wide? What if nothing needed answering? Bob never rushed to answer. He let the questions settle in the soil with the others. Some of them he planted like seeds on parchment, in memory or nowhere at all. He simply let them be. As the sun began to lean westward, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the time, Bob would gather a few sprigs of mint, perhaps, a dried fig from the tree, and carry them back into the house, moving slowly as if not to disturb the stillness. And the garden, now steeped in golden light, would remain behind, waiting, growing, breathing, just as it always had. Inside Bob's house, just as the sun began to lower and shadows crept longer across the garden, there came a time for tea. It was not a moment marked by a clock or a bell, but by a feeling, the shift in the wind, the way the light turned, softer, more golden, and the faint ache in the bones that whispered it was time to sit. Bob's tea was never hurried. It was not something poured from a pot and carried off while doing something else. No, for Bob, brewing tea was a ceremony of small movements, slow gestures, and quiet intention. Not formal, not elaborate, but deeply personal, something shaped by rhythm more than ritual. The kettle was made of old clay, darkened by the years and touched with fine cracks that hadn't deepened in decades. It rested on the edge of the hearth, near the same spot where the early light of morning first touched the stone floor. Its shape was round and slightly uneven, as if it had been shaped by hands that favored intuition over perfection. Before anything began, Bob would sit in silence beside the table. He'd place the kettle near the embers and wait not for the boil, but for the warmth to build slowly. Sometimes he would place a small stone beneath the kettle to raise it slightly, adjusting the height as if adjusting time itself. He never walked away during this stage. Instead, he stayed near, watching the faint waver of heat rise from the pot. His hands would rest on the tabletop, fingers lightly tapping or tracing the wood grain without thought. There was no rush. The water would heat when it was ready. Beside the hearth, a shelf held a collection of clay jars, each holding dried herbs gathered from the garden or nearby hills. Bob didn't keep them organized alphabetically or by purpose. He simply remembered where things lived. A jar of lemon balm wrapped with twine, mint leaves curled and pale, sage, rosemary, a bit of thyme, and sometimes, when the season allowed, slices of dried fig or orange rind, saved from sunnier days. Today, his hand reached for the mint and the lemon balm. He opened the jars slowly, lifting the lids as if opening a long-forgotten book. The scents rose gently, cool, sweet, calming. He pinched just a bit of each between his fingers and placed them into a small ceramic bowl. The leaves rustled quietly as they settled. Bob never measured. He chose by feel, by the weather, by what his hands reached for. Each cup of tea was slightly different, shaped by the day itself. Once the water had warmed, never quite boiling, he poured it gently into the bowl, just enough to cover the leaves. The first pour was always brief, like a greeting. He let the herbs rest in it for a moment, then poured that water out onto the floor beside the hearth. Not waste, he would have said, just clearing the dust of the leaves, waking them gently. Then came the second pour, slower, more deliberate. He filled the bowl halfway, letting the leaves swirl, then settle, releasing their oils into the warmth. The color of the water shifted pale green, touched with gold. He would sit back, not sipping yet, just watching the tiny bubbles rise, watching the steam curl and vanish. The tea spoke softly as it steeped, and Bob listened not to the sound, exactly, but to the space around it. Sometimes, if the day had been particularly warm, he added a pinch of dried lavender. Other times, a single clove dropped in like a memory. But today, it was only mint and balm, the kind of blend that felt like lying beneath a fig tree, or listening to the rain without needing to move. He poured the tea into a wide, handleless cup. The clay of the cup matched the kettle-worn, familiar, slightly flawed. The rim was chipped in one place, but Bob's lips always knew where not to rest. The first sip was never the best. It was too hot, too forward, so he waited, letting the cup warm his hands, letting the steam rise across his face. This, too, was part of the tea, the waiting, the holding, and noticing. When the tea had cooled just enough, he would sip. Not loudly, not quickly. Just enough to fill the mouth, to feel the warmth spread through the chest and into the limbs. The taste was soft, layered, subtle, nothing that demanded attention. Just enough to quiet the thoughts that had been trying too hard all day. Bob never read while drinking tea. He never talked, even to himself. Tea time was a space between things, a resting place, a small boat on a still pond. Some days he would sit for many minutes after the last sip, holding the empty cup, listening to the silence it left behind, the way it faded slowly, the way it invited something softer to arrive. Once finished, he didn't wash the cup right away. He let it sit, as if the tea wasn't quite ready to be forgotten. The scent lingered in the clay, faint and sweet, like a thought you almost remember just before sleep. The rest of the evening moved in the same quiet rhythm. The kettle was emptied. The leaves returned to the garden soil. The cup placed upside down near the hearth, not hidden away, just resting. And the house, now filled with the scent of warm mint and earth, settled into the hush of late day. Brewing tea, for Bob, was not a task. It was a conversation with stillness. A way to let the world grow quiet again. A way to be present with something small and simple, and in doing so, be present with himself. Tomorrow he would make tea again, perhaps with sage, perhaps with thyme and orange peel, but always, always slowly, always gently, always with the kind of patience that feels like kindness. And tonight, as the last traces of steam faded into the air, and the sun slipped behind the hills, Bob remained still. The tea had done what it needed to do. Not much, just enough. In the back corner of Bob's little house, just past the hearth and opposite the narrow sleeping room, was a low wooden door, barely tall enough for an average man to pass through without stooping. The hinges were old but smooth, and the handle a simple loop of worn bronze had long since lost its shine. Behind that quiet door was a room many might have called a study, though Bob never gave it a name. He simply called it the other room. The room held no windows, yet the light that found its way, in mostly from a small oil lamp near the wall, was soft and steady, never bright enough to disturb the shadows, never dim enough to lose the way. The air smelled of paper, dust, and dried rosemary and old scent, familiar and slightly sweet, like pages left open too long in the sun. Along every wall, shelves had been carved directly into the stone, each one sagging just a little in the middle, as if bowed under the slow weight of time. The wood was rough, aged to the color of dark honey. Dust blanketed everything in a light coat, undisturbed in places where even Bob's fingers seldom wandered. The scrolls came first. Rolled pieces of parchment tied with faded thread or thin strips of leather. Some bore faint symbols on the outer layers, Greek, perhaps, or something older, now only half understood. Others had no markings at all, as though they had always meant to remain secret. Their edges curled inward with age, like leaves in the heat of late summer. Bob never unraveled them all. Some he left as they were, content with the mystery. A few he had opened slowly, carefully, letting the parchment stretch and relax under the warmth of the lamp. What he found was rarely dramatic lists of plants, fragments of poems, faded sketches of stars. But he treated each one as if it held something precious, not because of what it said, but because someone, long ago, had thought to write it down. Next came the books. Most were small and bound in cracked leather or faded linen, the covers stiff and the pages uneven. Some had been rebound with rough thread where spines had split. Others had loose pages tucked between covers, as though they were always in the process of becoming something more complete. Bob had no index, no catalog, no particular system, but he remembered where things lived. He would run a hand along the row, fingers brushing gently until they paused, then pulled the volume free as though lifting it from sleep. One book, barely thicker than a finger, contained nothing but short questions written in tiny script, one per page. No answers followed, just quiet, open-ended invitations to think. Where does silence go when interrupted? One read. Another asked, "Does a shadow know it is being watched?" Bob had read it many times, and still he wasn't finished with it. Beside the books were stacks of folded parchment, filled with Bob's own notes. His handwriting was slow, slanted, occasionally smudged. Some pages bore only a few lines. Others were crowded with overlapping thoughts, drawn arrows, circles, and sketches that looked like spirals. Wind or the outlines of leaves. He didn't write for anyone else. His notes weren't meant to be published or preserved. They were more like stones placed along a path to mark where a thought had once paused, or where it might someday return. One corner of the room held a low table with a single chair, padded by a cushion so old its edges had frayed into long threads. This was where Bob sat when he read. Never for long stretches, just a few pages at a time, a thought or two gently stirred. He didn't consume knowledge. He sat beside it, as one might sit beside a still pond. Sometimes he didn't read at all. He would light the lamp, pour a small cup of tea, and sit with a closed book resting in his lap. In the quiet of the stone room, words didn't always need to be spoken to be heard. The lamp itself was modest, an olive oil lamp with a wide base and a single slow-burning wick. Its flame flickered gently, casting soft amber light across the shelves, catching dust motes that drifted like slow snowfall. Bob trimmed the wick with a small iron pin, keeping the flame low and steady. Too much light, he once scribbled in a margin, makes the words retreat. There were no decorations here. No paintings or statues, no tokens or trophies. Just paper, leather, stone, and silence. And yet the room was far from empty. It was filled with time. Not the ticking kind, but the kind that hums beneath thought. The kind that settles into corners and gathers like dust, not unwanted, but necessary. Here, time wasn't measured in hours or days, but in the weight of stillness, the turning of a single page, the moment between one thought and the next. Bob never tried to read everything. He knew that was not the point. The scrolls and books were not puzzles to be solved or ladders to be climbed. They were companions, like old friends who spoke only when spoken to, and even then, softly. Sometimes he would find a page he had written years before, just a few lines forgotten. He would read it again and nod slightly, not because he agreed or disagreed, but because it was familiar. Like finding a stone in the garden you once held in your hand. Other times he would find something he didn't remember writing at all. These were his favorites. not because they were wise, but because they felt like gifts from another version of himself, one who had paused once in a moment of clarity and left something behind. And so the shelves remained, dust and all. The scrolls curled and content. The books resting like old cats. The pages unread, not because they were unimportant, but because they were patient. Bob would visit this room most evenings, though not always to write or read. Sometimes he would simply stand among the shelves, close his eyes, and breathe in the smell of old parchment and olive wood. It reminded him, perhaps, that there was more to know than one lifetime allowed, and that knowing wasn't always the goal. Sometimes just to sit among questions was enough. Morning always came gently in Bob's house. The light arrived slowly through the green shutters, brushing across the stone floor in pale gold ribbons. The breeze from the olive trees outside slipped in first, bringing with it a trace of coolness and the faint scent of rosemary and soil. Dust floated lazily in the air, stirred not by motion, but by the quiet unfolding of time. There was no alarm, no rustle of purpose, only the breath of another day, stretching softly across the bones of the old house. Bob didn't wake so much as drift upward from sleep. His eyes opened only when the morning had settled fully into the room. For a while, he simply lay there, wrapped in the warmth of the linen blanket, listening to the slow rhythm of his own breath, the muted flutter of fig leaves against the window, and the distant murmur of birds. These first moments of wakefulness were his favorite, not yet thinking, not quite moving, just resting inside the soft space where nothing needed to begin. Eventually, his body stirred. Without effort, without rush, Bob sat up and placed his feet on the cool floor. He paused again there, feeling the worn stones beneath his soles, grounding himself not in thought, but in touch. The blanket was folded carefully and set aside. It was never tossed or left behind. Even that small motion held a kind of gratitude for rest, for quiet, for warmth. Nothing was done absent-mindedly. He rose slowly, joints creaking faintly, but without complaint, and moved toward the hearth. The fire had nearly gone out, but beneath the ash, a soft orange glow waited to return. Bob placed a few small twigs and dried stems onto the embers, and leaned in, breathing just enough to coax the flames back into the world. The fire responded gently, stretching upward in flickers, like a sleepy friend blinking open its eyes. The old kettle sat nearby, its belly blackened from countless mornings. Bob filled it with rainwater from the ceramic jar, then set it beside the fire's edge, not in the center, but just close enough to warm gradually. He never boiled water quickly. He believed that tea, like thought, did better when approached with patience. The soft click of clay against stone marked the beginning of his day, though no timepiece declared it so. While the kettle warmed, Bob opened the door and stepped outside. His bare feet met the morning path with familiarity. The flagstones were cool but smooth, dusted lightly with dew. Above him, the olive branches stirred. The sky was pale and soft, a color somewhere between gray and gold. Bees had not yet begun their busy talk. The garden stood in hush, holding its breath in the presence of the waking sun. He wandered for a while, not far, just enough to greet the world. His fingers trailed across thyme leaves, releasing a quick, peppery scent. The breeze moved across his skin and whispered against his ear, not to inform, but simply to exist beside him. The fig tree had dropped a single leaf in the night, and Bob knelt briefly to turn it over in his palm before letting it fall back to the earth. Nothing hurried, nothing expected. The morning asked nothing of him. Returning to the house, he found the water just beginning to steam. He added a small pinch of crushed mint and a sprig of thyme to a clay bowl, then poured the warm water over the herbs. The scent rose upward green and sweet, touched with earth. He held the bowl between both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers, and walked to the window table, where the light had now fully settled. Breakfast was simple. A piece of bread, lightly toasted beside the hearth. A small dish of olive oil, golden and thick, and a few olives from the previous evening. Sometimes a bit of honey, depending on the mood of the bees and the season's offering. He ate without distraction. No books. No thoughts of the day ahead. Just chewing slowly, tasting fully, and watching the way the shadows of vines danced on the table. The tea cooled gently as he sipped it in short, unhurried mouthfuls. It wasn't meant to energize or awaken. It was meant to accompany the silence. The herbs offered no jolt, only calm. The bowl warmed his palms, and the steam curled against his face. It was not about flavor or tradition. It was simply about presence. One sip, then stillness. Another sip, then stillness again. The morning moved in these quiet, patient rhythms. After the last sip, he stood and rinsed the bowl in a small basin of water, then placed it upside down on a linen cloth beside the hearth. The fire had settled now into a warm, glowing heart. Bob dusted crumbs from the table, folded the linen napkin, and tucked it back on its peg. The morning was complete, not marked by time, but by the feeling that nothing more was needed. The house had moved with him through the first breath of the day. He stepped outside once more. The sun had climbed a little higher, casting longer shadows beneath the olive trees. The stones of the path were beginning to warm. He walked to the edge of the grove, paused beneath a crooked fig, and looked out at the gently sloping hills. The air was open now. Birds moved more freely. Somewhere, a neighbor's goat brayed softly, as if remembering something long forgotten. There was no need to begin anything. Nothing pressed for his attention. Bob let the silence linger. He stood a while longer, then turned and walked slowly back toward the house, toward the waiting stillness inside. The morning had passed, not with fanfare or declaration, but with the quiet dignity of a cloud drifting across an open sky. It had offered itself completely, and Bob, in turn, had accepted its gift gratefully, gently, without ever needing to rush. Bob had a habit of walking the same path every few days, a meandering trail that curved gently away from his garden and disappeared between the olive trees. The path led to a place most villagers had long since stopped visiting, an old stone. Well, half sunk in earth, moss-covered and quiet. There was no need to draw water from it anymore. Yet Bob returned to it often, not to use it, but simply to be near it. The journey began without fanfare. He stepped onto the narrow path with bare feet, feeling the familiar texture of pebbles and dry leaves beneath him. The sunlight filtered softly through the olive branches above, painting dappled patterns on the ground. The breeze moved through, the trees in long, whispering waves. He didn't think of the well when he started walking. He only followed the rhythm of his own pace, slow and easy, as if time itself was following behind Dot as he moved deeper into the grove. The sounds of the village faded. There were no carts, no distant voices, only the gentle rustling of trees and the occasional call of a bird overhead. The path curved slightly, then descended into a gentle hollow. Here the air grew cooler, shaded by denser branches and thick bushes along the edge. He paused sometimes just to look not for anything, but to notice what was already there. A trail of ants, a stone split by weather and time. The sudden shimmer of a cobweb in the sun. There was a small wooden bench halfway along the path, built long ago by someone whose name had been lost to the wind. Bob often paused there, not always, to sit, but sometimes just to place a hand on the smooth grain of its worn surface. The bench faced east, toward a stretch of open sky. On quiet mornings, the clouds would move lazily across that sky, and Bob would stand still long enough to let his thoughts move just as slowly. He continued along the winding trail. The farther he walked, the quieter the world became, as if each step peeled away another layer of noise. The air carried the scent of wild oregano and warm stone. Somewhere nearby, a dove cooed softly, and its voice echoed in the hollow, spreading outward until it became part of the silence. Bob didn't respond, didn't analyze, didn't name it. He simply walked with it. Got at last, the path opened to a clearing. There, beneath the shade of an ancient fig tree, was the old stone well. It rose from the earth like a memory too old to explain. Its stones uneven and laced with creeping moss, the rim softened by weather. No bucket hung from it anymore. The wood frame above had collapsed years ago, but the well itself remained, whole and quiet. Bob approached it with the same ease one might greet a familiar friend. He reached out and ran his hand gently along the curve of the stone rim. It was cool to the touch and slightly damp from morning mist. Moss clung to the cracks like green lace, and tiny plants had taken root in its crevices. He did not look inside, not out of fear, but out of trust. The well held its own silence, and Bob respected that. He sat down on a flat stone near the base of the fig tree. The branches spread wide above him, casting a mottled light that danced slowly on the ground. The breeze tugged gently at the leaves, making them whisper their quiet music. Here, time moved even slower than at home. Minutes stretched like warm dough, long and loose, without resistance. He closed his eyes and let his breath follow the rhythm of the wind. The earth beneath him was warm. The stone supported his weight, as though it had done so 1,000 times. He placed both hands in his lap and let them rest there, open and unoccupied. There was no need for a book or a journal, no reason to gather thoughts. The well didn't ask for reflection. It offered only space, and space was enough. Now and then, a fig would drop to the ground with a soft thud. The sound was barely more than a breath, but it seemed to echo slightly, like a punctuation mark in the morning's still sentence. Ants would soon find the fallen fruit and begin their quiet, collective journey. Bob watched them for a moment, but without commentary or expectation. Just the noticing was complete. The sky above shifted gently, a few long, feathery clouds stretching across the blue. The light changed shade by degrees, never suddenly, never harsh. Bob tilted his head slightly to follow it, not because he needed to know the time, but because the sky had begun to write something across its surface, and he wanted to see the words unfold. Eventually, he stood again. His knees ached slightly, but the ache was a familiar companion, not a complaint. He brushed a few leaves from his tunic and turned back toward the path. He placed one hand on the rim of the well before leaving, just for a moment. Not to say goodbye, but simply to acknowledge it. The well did not answer. It had nothing to. Say that was part of why Bob liked it. The walk home was just as slow. He took the same steps, followed the same stones. But they felt different now. The walk to the well had been about arriving. The walk back was about returning. Each stone, each shadow, each breeze felt like a small gift handed back to him as he passed. The path, too, seemed to understand that it was no longer guiding a seeker, but welcoming someone home. By the time he stepped back into his garden, the light had grown fuller, spreading across the path and through the vines. The scent of lavender had grown stronger in the warming sun. He moved toward the door, passing the olive branches with a hand trailing behind him, feeling the softness of their leaves. He paused for a moment to look back at the grove, just once, then stepped inside, his bare feet making no sound. The walk to the well had changed nothing. And yet, in the stillness it gave him, it had changed everything. There were days when Bob would sit for hours in his garden, his eyes lifted gently toward the sky. He did not study the heavens with intensity, nor did he track weather patterns or read omens in the breeze. He simply watched the clouds as they passed, slow, unhurried shapes wandering across an endless blue, shifting gently from one form to another, as if forgetting what they had just been. Clouds, to Bob, were not objects to be explained. They were companions in thought-gentle mirrors that reflected the quiet inside him. He liked the way they moved without effort. They didn't seem to go anywhere in particular. They just floated, content to exist for a while before turning into something else. That was enough. He preferred the high, slow clouds, the ones that didn't try to impress. Not the storm clouds that swelled and billowed with restless energy, nor the heavy gray blankets that spoke of coming rain. The clouds Bob loved were soft, thin veils drifting across a patient sky. They were clouds that left space between them, so the blue could breathe. They asked nothing and gave everything. Sometimes he would lean back against the olive tree, arms crossed behind his head, and let his eyes follow a single cloud until it dissolved. He never named what he saw. He didn't point out animals or ships or faces, the way children sometimes do. To him, each cloud was already complete in its shapelessness. It didn't need to be turned into anything. It didn't need to mean more than it already was. He once watched a wide, slow-moving cloud stretch across half the sky. It looked like nothing in particular, a smear of white with threads unspooling from its edges. He followed it for nearly an hour, not because it was interesting, but because it existed. Its pace reminded him of something, not a memory, but a rhythm, a kind of breathing he used to know. The cloud drifted, then thinned, then faded. He never looked away. In watching clouds, Bob found a kind of silence he couldn't find anywhere else. It wasn't the silence of a closed room, nor the hush of nightfall. It was a soft, breathing silence, open, expansive, full of slow movement, and empty of demand. It was the kind of silence that filled rather than emptied, that loosened thoughts rather than held them in place. He believed clouds taught him how to think not in lines or arguments, but in curves. Thoughts that rose, drifted, faded, returned. Thoughts that didn't need conclusions. Just the act of thinking was enough. The movement was the meaning. The sky, in this way, was like a page that erased itself slowly, without regret. Now and then, the clouds would gather more closely together. The sky would darken just slightly, and a hush would fall across the garden. Not fear, not warning, just a quiet thickening, like the sky pulling a blanket around its shoulders. Bob would notice the shift in light, the softened edges of the olive leaves, the way the shadows lost their sharpness. He would sit quietly, watching the transformation without interrupting it. There were days when the sky was completely clear, no clouds, only the endless blue. On those days, Bob did not feel disappointment. He simply waited. He knew the clouds would return. They always did. Their absence was not emptiness, but rest. Even the sky, he thought, needed moments of quiet between appearances. He once wrote, "On the edge of a scrap of parchment, a cloud does not rush to become a cloud. It forms, and that is enough." He folded the parchment and placed it inside a small wooden box with other thoughts, notes that weren't meant to be read again, but were kept for the pleasure of writing them down. His favorite time for cloud watching was the early afternoon, when the sun had risen high, but the shadows had not yet stretched. The air was warm, but not heavy. The birds had quieted, and even the insects seemed to move more slowly. It was a time when the world seemed to exhale, and in that long breath, clouds moved across the sky like soft thoughts crossing the mind of the day. Bob never watched with purpose. He never tried to predict their patterns. He never wished them to stay longer, or move faster, or be anything other than what they were. In their drifting, he found a lesson he never tired of learning, that movement did not require effort, that change did not demand struggle, and that presence could exist without definition. He would sometimes close his eyes while sitting beneath the open sky and picture the clouds continuing their journey above him. Even with his vision darkened, he could feel them passing. He imagined the light growing and fading across his face, the temperature shifting slightly, the dance of shadow and brightness across the tops of the trees. All of it unseen, yet all of it known. In his garden, the olive trees watched the sky as he did, their branches lifted upward, their leaves shimmering softly with each passing wind. Bob thought the trees, too, must have their own thoughts about clouds. Perhaps not in words, but in feeling. A kind of shared recognition between the grounded and the drifting. Roots below, clouds above, both part of the same stillness, the same slow unfolding of time. And when the day reached its midpoint, and the clouds began to thin again, Bob would rise from where he sat, stretch gently, and walk back toward the house. He carried nothing with him, no record, no interpretation, only the memory of movement, of softness, of watching something pass without needing to hold it. The clouds would continue long after he left. They would drift into the distance, change shape, become rain or disappear. And Bob, back in his quiet stone house, would return to his tea or his notes, his thoughts, filled not with conclusions, but with that same lightness he had watched above an inner weather that mirrored the calm of the sky. As afternoon slipped quietly into early evening, the light in Bob's home began to change. It didn't vanish suddenly, nor did it grow dim with urgency. Instead, it softened, pulling back like tidewater from a quiet shore. The sun, once high and warm, now leaned lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched gently across the stone floor, touching the corners of the room like fingers brushing fabric. Bob always noticed the moment when the light began to tilt. It wasn't dramatic, just a shift in tone. The gold grew deeper, warmer, as if steeped in tea. Shadows no longer clung close to their objects, but wandered freely, stretching across shelves, over books, and along the edges of wooden chairs. The house became quiet in a new way, not the hush of sleep, but the hush of something drawing to a close. He often paused during this time. Whatever light task he was doing, a bit of writing, a slow sweep of the floor, a sip of tea gone cool, he let it fall away. The afternoon hour asked for nothing, only attention. So Bob gave it his attention, in full. He would stand still, watching the beams of light gather and bend, watching the dust swirl lazily through the golden air. Time slowed even further in that hour. The olive oil lamp sat on a low shelf near the hearth. It was small and made of clay, its shape simple and steady, with a round belly and a narrow spout for the wick. The surface had darkened over the years, stained by smoke and warmth. Bob had used it for decades. It had no decoration, no signature, only utility softened by age. To him, it was more than an object. It was a companion to the night. Before lighting the lamp, Bob would prepare it slowly. He cleaned the spout with a folded bit of linen, clearing the soot from its edges. Then he fetched the oil from a cool corner of the house, where it was kept in a green glass bottle. He poured just enough, never too much, into the lamp, careful not to spill a drop. The scent of olive pressed itself gently into the air, grassy, earthy, a reminder of the grove just outside. Next came the wick, a simple strip of woven flax, cut and curled with care. He placed it with precision, letting it rest in the oil and rise just enough to meet the flame. The match he used was struck with little noise, its flare brief and fading. The flame caught, danced once, then settled into a quiet, steady glow. It gave off no sound, only warmth, only presence. Bob placed the lamp at the center of the table. The flame cast soft gold across the stone surface, illuminating the worn grooves and faded scratches, like a topography of memory. Around the lamp, the room began to change. Walls took on color, shadows grew tender and deep. Objects once flat and silent came alive with a kind of quiet clarity. The flame did not chase away the dark. It welcomed it. Gently he often sat beside. The lamp, not to do anything, but simply to be near the light. His hands would rest on the table, palms down, fingers still. The warmth from the clay would rise, touch his skin, and spread outward. The flame flickered slightly when the wind touched the shutter. It was not a shiver of fear, but a kind of greeting, as if the outside world had leaned in to say, "Hello, outside." The garden shifted into dusk. The bees had gone quiet, returning to their hidden chambers in the wall. The olive leaves no longer shimmered. They settled like quiet hands folded. In rest. Even the birds stopped their calls. The entire grove exhaled, slow and deep, and Bob listened without moving. The house, too, seemed to sigh, its walls cooling as the sun dipped below the hills. Inside, the lamp glowed. It wasn't bright. It didn't try to banish the dark corners. Instead, it lit only what was near. A book's edge, a basket's handle, the curve of a clay bowl resting upside down. It was light for living, not for seeing. Light that invited slowness. Light that asked you to lean in and pause. Bob appreciated that. He didn't want clarity. He wanted quietness made visible. He would sometimes place a small object beside the lamp, a pebble, a dried fig leaf, an old bronze key with no known door, and watch how the flame changed it, how the shadow softened its shape, how warmth wrapped itself around the familiar, making it new again. In this gentle glow, the ordinary was not transformed. It was simply noticed more tenderly. Time in the lamp-lit room moved differently. Minutes no longer marched. They floated, indistinct, like moths in the evening air. Bob didn't mark the passage. He didn't need to know how long he had sat. The flickering of the flame was time enough. If it leaned left, time leaned with it. If it stood still, so did the hour. Eventually, the flame would lower itself, dipping slightly as the oil was slowly drawn upward. Bob would watch this, knowing its rhythm well. He didn't intervene. He let the lamp decide its own pace. It would burn for hours, but never too long. It always seemed to know when to rest. He once wrote in the back margin of a worn book, "Let the light teach you to slow your breathing." The words were faint now, ink faded by time, but he remembered writing them. Not to be profound, not to be remembered. Just to write them down in the presence of the flame. As the light outside faded into full dusk, and the last of the sun's warmth left the walls, Bob sat still. The olive oil lamp held its steady circle of gold. The rest of the world could wait. There was nothing to do, nowhere to be. The day had softened into night, and night had opened its quiet arms in return. In the calm of that lamplit space, thought no longer needed words. Breath no longer needed instruction. The world had slowed to a whisper, and Bob, sitting quietly beside the glow, let it carry him into the first hush of evening, wrapped in light, wrapped in stillness. There was a quiet ritual Bob held on to, one that came not with urgency, but with him. Folding laundry, for him, was not a task to be finished, but a kind of silent meditation. Once every few days, when the breeze had dried his linens and tunics, on the old rope line outside, he would gather them in a shallow woven basket and bring them in, still carrying the scent of sun and wind. He never rushed the folding. The act began with laying the pieces out one by one on the table near the window, with a soft afternoon light spilled gently across the stone surface. He'd smooth each cloth carefully with his palms, fingers open, gentle, like someone closing a page in a long-forgotten book. The fabric held warmth from the sun, and sometimes the crisp edge of wind. He noticed these things. The linen pieces were few, mostly simple shirts, a tunic or two, a few cloths for wiping or wrapping. Bob didn't own more than he needed. Each item had a place in his life, and each had earned the small honor of being folded with care. He started with the largest, letting the edges fall into alignment, creasing not with force, but with gravity, letting the cloth find its own lines as he guided it softly in folding. Bob felt time slow. His thoughts, which often wandered elsewhere, during the day, came to rest beside him. There were no great questions to solve while folding laundry, no answers waiting behind the folds. There was only the breath, the fabric, the light through the shutters, and the rhythm of hands moving slowly and with purpose. It was a kind of quiet agreement between body and world. He believed that how one did small things mattered, not because of consequence, but because of attention. Folding was a chance to place awareness into each motion, to make space in the day where nothing needed to be solved or chased. In those moments, the world narrowed not in a limiting way, but in a comforting way. The table, the cloth, the light, these became the whole world, and that was enough. Sometimes he would pause with a shirt in his hands, just to feel the weave of the fabric. It was coarse in places, worn smooth in others. A patch on the elbow reminded him of a day spent pruning fig branches. A faint thread of green at the hem might have come from thyme or olive sap. The fabric told stories, but not loudly. You had to be quiet to hear them. The stack grew slowly, each piece folded in a slightly different way, depending on shape and texture. There was no perfection sought, just care. Some folds curved, some lines overlapped. That didn't matter. What mattered was that each item had been seen, touched, considered. Folding was a way of saying, I am here, and this is worthy of attention. Even if no one would ever see the neat stack, it still mattered. Bob once wrote in a notebook, tucked beneath a pile of dried bay leaves, order is not control. It is a kind of kindness. He never explained it. He didn't need to. Folding laundry was a kind of kindness toward the self, toward the fabric, toward the day that asked only to be lived attentively. When the folding was done, he would sit for a moment and simply look at the stack, not with pride, but with quiet appreciation. There was a symmetry to it, not of precision, but of presence. The folded linens reflected the shape of the moment they were folded in calm, slow warmth. With afternoon sun, he did not rush to put them away. Letting them sit a while was part of the ritual. Sometimes, while sitting there beside the folded stack, Bob would listen to the wind outside shifting the leaves. The sound, soft and rhythmic, seemed to echo the folding itself, a natural repetition. A motion of order, not imposed, but allowed. The house creaked gently in the warmth. The shadows had begun to stretch again, long and thin along the floor. Eventually, he would rise. The folded laundry found its way to shelves and drawers, each item sliding quietly into its resting place. He did not stack them tightly. He left small spaces between things, room for the fabric to breathe, room for the moment to remain. Even the act of placing things away was part of the rhythm, done with the same softness as the folding. He thought of the ancients sometimes, those who had no machines, no urgency, just their hands in the day. He imagined someone 1,000 years ago folding cloth in the same way, under a similar sky, by a similar window. The gesture, he felt, connected him to them, not through grand ideas, but through the shared humility of simple care. And when it was done, and the shelf was quietly full again, Bob would return to his chair by the window. The basket now empty, the table clear once more. But something had shifted. The house felt different. Not brighter, not cleaner, just more at ease, as if it too had settled into a gentler order. The day continued, but now with a softened edge, a rhythm reestablished. Folding laundry had not changed the world. It hadn't solved a problem or answered a question. But it had folded something else, the scattered pieces of the afternoon, the drifting thoughts, the subtle restlessness of quiet hours. It had gathered those pieces together, aligned them softly, and laid them to rest in the stillness of a drawer. In the late afternoon, when the light had softened into gold and the warmth of the sun was no longer sharp, Bob would make his way to the fig tree that stood quietly at the edge of his garden. It was an old tree with a thick, twisting trunk and wide branches that curved outward like open arms. Beneath it, the ground was dry and cool, shaded by the broad green leaves that trembled gently in the light breeze. Bob did not always go there with intention. Sometimes his feet carried him without asking. He would arrive barefoot and quiet, and settle into the familiar hollow at the tree's base, where the roots formed a kind of natural seat. The bark pressed firmly against his back. The soil was soft beneath him. He would sit, and he would listen not to music or voices, but to the wind as it moved through the leaves above. The fig leaves made a sound like no other, neither rustling like olive trees, nor whispering like grasses. It was a deeper, fuller sound, like a slow river of air passing through silk. It shifted in tone with the strength of the wind, rising and falling like a breath taken and released. Bob found this sound more comforting than silence. It reminded him that the world was always moving, but never hurried. With his eyes closed, he could feel the rhythm of the wind before he heard it, a stirring in the skin, a brush across the cheeks. Then the sound would follow, growing and swelling. Among the leaves, wrapping around the branches, and curling down to where he sat. The fig tree spoke in this way, wordless, patient, full of meaning that could not be written down. Bob never tried to interpret the wind. He didn't ask what it meant or where it came from. He let it be what it was, a movement of air through living things, a messenger with no message. In doing so, he received everything. The rustling leaves reminded him of old stories he had never heard, of forgotten languages, of lullabies carried on the backs of birds. At times, he opened his eyes and looked upward, watching the way the light filtered through the green canopy. The sun flickered in soft pulses as the wind moved the leaves, casting shadows that danced across his face and hands. It was a slow dance, without rhythm, without beginning or end, just movement for its own. Saki, just light and leaf and time overlapping in gentle layers. The branches of the fig tree creaked now and then, not loudly, but like the settling of bones. Bob found comfort in those sounds, too. They reminded him that the tree was not just still, it was alive. It shifted with the breeze, stretched with age, responded to the weight of light and air. Sitting beneath it, he felt himself becoming part of that life, not separate from it. He sometimes brought a small folded cloth to place on the ground, but often he didn't bother. The earth was clean and dry, and his robes would gather only a little dust. He didn't mind. Dust was part of the day, part of the garden, part of the long conversation between the sky and the soil. Bob never saw it as dirt, only as a reminder that everything rested upon something older. A fig would occasionally drop from the tree, landing with a soft thump nearby. Ripe and warm, it would split slightly on impact, releasing its scent into the air, a mixture of sugar, sap, and sun. Bob rarely ate them immediately. He preferred to let them lie for a while, to return later and find them again, as if the tree had left them there as small, sweet offerings. In the wind and shade, Bob's thoughts would drift, not racing or leaping, but meandering like the branches above him. He would think about nothing in particular, perhaps the shape of the clouds he had seen earlier, or the way the light hit a stone on the garden path. Thoughts came and went without invitation. Some stayed longer. Others dissolved before he could follow them. He allowed them all. This hour, beneath the fig tree, became a kind of stillness within motion. Everything around him moved, the leaves, the shadows, the light, but he remained rooted like the tree itself. not unmoving, but grounded, listening, breathing, accepting. There was no goal in this, no outcome to be achieved. It was enough to sit and let the wind pass through him. Sometimes, when the wind grew stronger, the tree would sway slightly, and a branch would lower as if bowing toward him. Bob would smile inwardly at the gesture. The tree, he believed, was not performing. It was simply responding just as he was. Two quiet things sharing a moment in the world's great exhale. No conversation, but deep connection nonetheless. He once wrote, very faintly on a torn bit of paper, "The wind teaches you not to hold on too tightly." He folded the paper and placed it under a stone near the base of the tree. He didn't revisit it. He didn't need to. The wind would remember. For him, as the light shifted further, growing warmer, then cooler, then dim, Bob would slowly rise. The tree gave a low creak, as if acknowledging his movement. He brushed his hands together softly, then placed them on the rough bark in thanks, not in ritual, but in simple gratitude. The wind still moved through the leaves above, continuing its journey without pause. Walking back to the house, the wind followed him, tugging lightly at his sleeves, brushing the backs of his ankles. It had nothing more to say. Or perhaps it had said all there was to say. The fig tree behind him stood quietly, its branches once again still. But the sound of its leaves lingered in his ears, like a memory made not of thought, but of texture and breath. In a shallow wooden drawer, near Bob's old writing desk, there rested a single cracked tablet of clay. It had once been whole, perhaps shaped with care by someone's hands many years before Bob came to possess it. Now it bore a gentle fracture. Down the middle, and the edges had softened with time, worn smooth by fingers, dust, and stillness. Bob had never tried to repair it. The crack was part of its nature, part of its memory. On quiet afternoons, especially those brushed by the hush of fading light, Bob would slide the drawer open and lift the tablet out with both hands. He always held it as one might carry something fragile, but not delicate, aware of its weight, its balance, its history. It was not precious. It was not useful in the way that other things might be, but it was honest. And that was enough. He would set it gently on the desk, brushing away the stray bits of olive leaf or lint that had settled since his last visit. There was no ink involved, no parchment, no pen. Instead, Bob used a thin wooden stylus, rounded at one end, narrow at the tip. He had carved it himself from a fig branch many seasons ago. It still carried the faintest scent of the tree, hidden. Deep in the grain dot, his notes on the tablet were never long, never orderly. A few words at a time, spaced out as if each thought needed to breathe. He did not aim for permanence. The clay, though hardened, could still be scraped clean if needed. But Bob rarely wiped it. He liked the way the words faded slowly over the seasons, sun-kissed and softened by time, as though they were melting gently back into silence. He never planned what he would write. The act was not a recording of anything fixed, but a conversation with the quiet within him. Sometimes it was a fragment of thought, other times an image or a shape of language that felt like it belonged in that moment. He would press the stylus softly into the surface, forming lines that curled or broke, depending on the clay's mood that day. Not one afternoon, he wrote, "A thought is not a stone. It does not need to stay." The letters were uneven, the spacing irregular, and the line faded into a faint scratch near the end. He did not trace over it. He left it to finish itself in time, as all things do. He once wrote upside down, not by mistake, but simply to see if it changed how the words felt. Another time, he drew a spiral instead of words, letting the line tighten in on itself until it vanished in a point near the corner. He looked at that spiral, often not for meaning, but for the stillness it seemed to hold. like the center of a slow breath. The cracked section of the tablet never took ink well. Sometimes the stylus would skip over it or catch slightly in the fracture. Bob never avoided the crack. In fact, he often wrote across it, letting the break interrupt his words the way wind might interrupt a thought. The fracture became part of the writing, part of the language. Not a flaw, but a texture dot to write on clay was, for Bob, a different kind of time. There was no correction, no hurry. Each stroke of the stylus carried with it a sense of small ceremony, nothing dramatic, but deeply quiet. The act of pressing into earth, even dried and cooled, reminded him that thought could leave a mark without needing to remain. That expression could be temporary and still meaningful. He sometimes left the tablet in the window after writing, letting the sun warm its surface. The clay would grow slightly lighter in tone, the letters more shallow. And slowly, over the course of many days, what he had written would soften until it could barely be seen. He welcomed this. Erasure was not loss. It was part of the cycle. Bob never read the whole tablet at once. He didn't use it as a record or a journal. He preferred to glance at it sideways, catching phrases or shapes as if they belonged to someone else. He believed the best thoughts were the ones that stayed half-remembered, like dreams that whispered rather than shouted out sometimes. A friend would visit and ask about the slab of clay. Bob would smile, say nothing, and gently place it back in the drawer. It wasn't secret, but it wasn't something to be shared either. The writing on the tablet wasn't meant for preservation. It was like wind across sand, visible only for a while, then gone, leaving only the feeling of having been there. He once etched into the edge, near the corner, "This is not for keeping." A reminder, perhaps, to himself more than to anyone else, that some things existed only to be done, not to be saved. The act itself was the meaning. The lines, the press of wood into clay, the quiet of the room, all of it enough. On some evenings, when the light had grown too dim to see clearly, Bob would return the tablet to its place, brushing his fingers across the surface one last time. The texture of the clay was cool, slightly uneven, like the surface of old stone. He placed it back into the drawer with care, not reverence, and slid it closed with a soft sound. The room would feel slightly different afterward. Not fuller, not emptier, just slightly more present. As if the act of writing, however small, had shifted something in the air. And perhaps it had. Perhaps all the words that faded into the clay still floated gently in the corners of the room. Unseen but lingering. Bob never rushed to write again. The tablet would wait. It always did. And when the moment came, when the light was just so, and the breeze touched the curtain with a sigh, he would know. He would open the drawer, lift the clay, and write again. Not to preserve, not to share, not to prove. Just to remember how it felt to press a thought gently into the earth and let it go. There are many kinds of silence, and Bob had come to know them all. Silence was not a singular absence, but 1,000 different presences. It was the hush before the light entered his windows, the still pause between the rustling of leaves, the breath held by the air itself as it passed through the olive trees. He did not chase it. It arrived gently, unhurried, sometimes unnoticed, until it had already made its home in the corners of the day. Bob welcomed it as one welcomes shade in summer, not with excitement, but with a quiet exhale. It brought no answers, but asked no questions either. The silence within the house was like a warm blanket, folded and familiar. It pressed lightly against the stone walls and pooled in the shadows that gathered under the shelves. Each room held it differently. The kitchen's silence was faintly scented with herbs and warmth. The hallway's silence stretched long and narrow, echoing ever so slightly with the creak of passing feet. And in the library, silence lay deepest of all, settled between pages, resting in the dust on the shelves, patient as old parchment. Bob moved gently through it, careful not to disturb what had settled so beautifully in place. The silence of the garden was wider, more spacious, edged with birdsong and the faint crackle of sun-dried leaves. It was a silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the garden walls into the hills, into the sky. Sometimes, when he sat beneath the fig tree, Bob would notice how even the bees moved quietly, their hum blending into the still air. Nothing felt interrupted, not even by sound. A falling olive, a bird's wing slicing the air, the breeze nudging a low branch each belonged to silence, as threads belong to a larger fabric. It was not the lack of sound, but the fullness of stillness. Inside himself, Bob had come to know another silence, one that didn't follow the hours or seasons, but its own quiet rhythm. This silence didn't always appear, even when he wanted it. It came in moments when he let go of doing, of thinking, of needing anything at all. Often it visited when he was brushing crumbs from the table, or folding a cloth, or sitting on the edge of the bed without purpose. In those moments, his thoughts softened, like leaves floating down a slow stream. The silence within was not empty. It was simply a space where nothing needed to be said, and that was enough. He never tried to force silence. He never measured it or captured it. Silence to Bob was like light on water. It could be seen, felt, welcomed, but never held. He let it come and go as it wished. Sometimes it came with the scent of sun-warmed stone. Other times it came with the creak of his old chair as he shifted slightly to follow the shadows on the wall. Bob believed silence had a shape, though not one he could draw. It curved softly around objects, slipped beneath doors, lingered in the folds of blankets. He never tried to define it, only to live alongside it. Some silences were different in wait. There was the light, almost playful silence of a spring afternoon, when the garden stirred but said little. There was the deep, restful silence of a stormy evening, when rain filled every window, and yet nothing needed to be spoken. And then there was the silence that came just before sleep, a profound, slow silence that seemed to reach backward and forward in time. Bob felt it settle over him like a second skin. In that silence, even thought dared not raise its voice. Everything slowed, everything softened. It was the closest thing to stillness he had ever known. Silence could also be heavy, though not in a way that burdened. It was the silence of remembering, of things long past. Sometimes it came while he gazed into the flame of a small candle or looked out into the dark beyond his tiled roof. That silence carried the echo of footsteps long since gone, voices that no longer spoke, but Bob did not resist it. He sat with it the same way he sat with lighter silences. It was not sorrowful. It was simply deeper, as a well is deeper than a bowl. Silence, he believed, held both the living and the forgotten with equal tenderness. He once scratched a phrase into the edge of an old wooden bench. Silence is the softest teacher. He did not remember where the words came from, or if they were his own, but they felt true. In silence, he learned how to notice, how to sit still, how to breathe without reaching, how to be where he was. He learned that not every moment needed shaping. Some moments only needed room to unfold. And silence, when welcomed, made more space than any room could. It was the architecture of rest, the invisible frame that allowed thoughts to loosen, emotions to stretch, and being to settle. Even sound itself could be part of silence. A soft breath, the brushing of cloth against stone, the gentle crackle of the oil lamp, these were not intrusions. They were companions. Silence did not resist sound, but held it gently, allowing it to pass through without disruption. That was its true strength. It was not fragile. It could hold a storm or a sigh with the same care. Bob often thought of silence as the sky itself vast enough to carry all weather, but never changed by it. In silence, he could sit for hours and never feel alone, for the quiet always remained beside him. And so, as the evening hours deepened, and the coolness returned to the edges of the stone walls, Bob rested in silence once more, not waiting for sleep, not thinking of tomorrow, just resting. The candle's light flickered once, then steadied. The fig leaves outside had gone still. The house made no sound, and yet it was full of memory, of breath, of a stillness so complete it felt like a kind of presence. Bob closed his eyes slowly, not to leave the world, but to enter further into it. And there, wrapped in silence, he drifted gently toward rest. There was a patch of dry earth beside Bob's garden, just wide enough for the afternoon sun to rest upon it fully. In this little circle of light, Bob had spent many quiet hours doing something that, to most, might seem without purpose. He gathered smooth pebbles from the edges of his property stones, worn round by time and weather, and arranged them into patterns on the ground. It was not art in the usual sense, nor was it something he showed to anyone. The designs were simple. Spirals, rings, clusters shaped like leaves or waves. They meant nothing, but in the making, something in him settled. He never began with a plan. The pebbles themselves seemed to guide him. One would rest just so beside another, then another, and before long, a shape would emerge. Sometimes it curved inward like a shell. Other times it stretched out like rays from a sleeping sun. He never corrected the lines if they bent strangely, or if one stone sat awkwardly. Each placement was a response to the last. The process was slow, gentle, almost sleepy. He worked without thinking. His fingers moved while his mind wandered, as if tracing thoughts in the dust without needing to name them. The sun during these afternoons warmed the back of his neck and cast soft shadows behind the stones. Light and form danced together, changing with each passing minute. A pebble placed in early sunlight would look different by late afternoon, its color deeper, its edges more pronounced. Bob liked this about the patterns. They never stayed the same for long. As the sun moved, the pattern changed. Even the wind added its touch, shifting a few grains of earth, sometimes nudging a pebble slightly out of place. He never minded. The beauty was not in permanence, but in presence. He often used the same stones, returned to the same space, and began again. Pattern made one day might be brushed away the next by his own hand, or by the feet of a curious bird. He would not resist this erasure. There was comfort in knowing nothing needed to last to have mattered. The stones remembered their places, even if the shapes they formed did not remain. In that dusty patch of earth, creation and disappearance were not in conflict. They were companions, trading places with the quiet rhythm of afternoon light and evening breeze. Sometimes a breeze would lift and scatter a few dry leaves across his work. He never brushed them away immediately. They became part of the design, as natural as the stones themselves. A feather once landed in the center of a spiral, and he left it there until it floated off again. These moments, unplanned and gentle, became highlights in the slow unfolding of the pattern. Bob did not see them as interruptions. They were reminders that he was not alone in shaping the world around him. The earth, the air, even the smallest insects all played their part. As the hours passed, shadows lengthened. The stones glowed less brightly, their colors muted under the weight of the coming evening. Bob would pause then, looking over what had been made, not with pride, but with stillness. He didn't ask himself whether the pattern was beautiful. He simply noticed it, how the lines curved, where they broke, where they held. The act of noticing was enough. It brought him closer to the ground, to the silence, to the steady pulse of time moving without rush. He sat with the pattern as one might sit with an old friend saying little, sharing much. There was a softness to the patterns, a roundness born of patience. No sharp lines, no harsh edges. Just circles within circles, shapes flowing into one, another like water into sand. He thought of them sometimes as echoes of thoughts, of memories, of things never spoken aloud. The stones, arranged without words, seemed to hold space for everything he did not try to explain. It was a kind of quiet language, made not to be read, but to be felt. In the drawing and redrawing, he found a rhythm that soothed something deep. And unspoken within him, that by late afternoon, the light shifted toward gold, and the temperature cooled. Bob's hands slowed. His back ached gently in a way he had come to know well, a friendly ache, the kind that came with doing something simple. For a long time, he would lean back then, resting his weight on his palms, and look up at the sky above the olive trees. The breeze would move across his face, soft and indifferent. The stones remained, forming their silent shapes, untouched by meaning, full of presence. He did not need to finish anything. The pattern was never finished. It simply paused. Eventually, the light would dip low enough that the shadows overtook the stones. Their edges would blur, their colors fade into the dust. Bob would gather a few into his basket, leave others in place. He would rise slowly, brushing off his knees, and step quietly back toward the house. He never looked back to see the whole. Design, it wasn't important. What mattered was the act itself, the placement of one stone, then another, the way his fingers knew where to go. Tomorrow, he might return and begin again. Or not. The pattern would wait, even if it changed. And so, another afternoon passed, without fanfare, without story. Just Bob, the earth, and a handful of stones. The pattern he made would not be remembered, nor did it need to be. It had lived in the warmth of sunlight, the hush of breeze, the softness of a hand placing something where it had not been before. And that was enough. As Bob stepped inside, the last light of the day caught the curve of one small pebble still resting in the dust, glowing faintly before the shadows returned. A whisper of form, a trace of time, a quiet gesture made, and then let go. There was something ceremonial about the way Bob prepared his evening meal. It was never elaborate, never hurried. He gathered what was needed from the same places each day, as if moving through a gentle ritual passed down not through instruction, but through repetition. A loaf of bread, dark and dense, rested in the cupboard wrapped in linen. A small bowl of olives sat patiently near the windowsill, and from the coolest corner of the kitchen, a wedge of cheese, pale and crumbly, waited, under a clay lid. These were not extravagant things, but they held a quiet dignity all their own. He placed everything on a wooden board worn smooth with years of use. The board, like the meal, carried no ornamentation. It was simple and sound, its edges slightly curved from the passage of time. Each item was laid with care. The bread first, sliced slowly, each cut deliberate. Then the olives, glistening and dark, nestled into a small ceramic dish. Lastly, the cheese, broken gently with the edge of a faux. Dull knife, its crumble soft and uneven. There was no rush, no performance, only presence. In Bob's world, preparing food was not a task. It was a quiet acknowledgment of being alive. Outside, the light dimmed as the sun settled behind the hills. The room filled with the kind of golden dusk that made even the dust in the air shimmer. Bob lit a small oil lamp on the table. Its flame flickered to life with the faintest sound, like a breath taken in a dream. The glow washed over the stone walls, softening every line, every crack. This light did not chase away the dark, but welcomed it, inviting it closer, allowing shadow and glow to mingle in the corners. The meal sat within this warmth, waiting. Bob, too, waited not out of delay, but reverence. He poured a little olive oil into a dish. The oil caught the lamplight like liquid gold. Its scent rose slowly, earthy and green, like crushed leaves in the sun. Beside it, a pinch of salt, kept in a small wooden box, waited to be scattered sparingly across the bread. These touches were small, almost unnoticeable, but to Bob, they were everything. They completed the shape of the meal, like the final stroke of a brush on a painting never meant to be displayed. He dipped the bread, tore a piece, placed it on his plate, and sat. No prayer, no speech. Just quiet attention. As he ate, time softened around him. There was no conversation, no clatter of cutlery or sound of distant voices. Only the small sounds of eating crust cracking, olives slipping gently from the dish, cheese giving way beneath his fingers. These were sounds not of hunger, but of satisfaction. Each bite held memory. The fields where the olives once grew, the hands that kneaded the dough, the goat that gave milk for the cheese. Bob didn't dwell on these things consciously, but they lived inside the flavors, woven through the meal. Like threads through cloth. The room cooled as night deepened. The lamp's flame bent slightly as the air shifted. Bob sipped water from a clay cup, the rim worn smooth against his lips. There was nothing added, no herbs, no wine, just water, drawn earlier from the old stone well. It tasted of minerals and quiet stone. He held it in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, letting its coolness anchor him. In this stillness, even drinking water became an act of mindfulness. The body nourished, the mind quieted, the spirit settled. This was not a feast, but it was full. On the windowsill, the sky darkened to indigo. A few stars blinked through, shy at first, then steady. From the garden came the sound of a fig leaf loosening and falling, its gentle landing almost imperceptible. The house breathed softly around him, its old bones creaking in places, shifting like a body settling into bed. Bob finished his last bite of bread, wiped his fingers with a cloth, and leaned back slightly. His plate was nearly empty. Just a single olive remained, resting in oil. He left it there. It felt right, somehow, that something should remain unfinished. He did not rush to clean. The meal's end was not a signal for movement, but a pause, a space to feel the weight of the moment. He sat in the low light, surrounded by the gentle echoes of his meal. The oil lamp still glowed, the wick steady, its light no longer reaching the corners of the room. He looked at the board, the knife, the empty dish. Nothing grand had taken place. And yet, in the quiet completeness of it, something had been honored. Not the food, not the ritual, but the simplicity of presence. A small, sacred ordinary. Eventually, he stood and carried the board to the counter. The linen cloth that once held the bread was folded again. The oil was covered. A plate was rinsed in a bowl of water and left to dry by the hearth. Each gesture was slow, considered. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. These movements were not chores, they were closure. The room darkened around him as the lamp was finally snuffed. A trace of olive and warm wax hung in the air. The night had fully arrived. Bob stepped back from the table, full not only with food, but with the peace of having needed little. He paused once more before heading to bed, casting one last look at the cleared table, the glow of stars beyond the open window. In the quiet stillness that followed his humble supper, the world seemed more spacious, as if expanded by the very act of slowing down. His meal had not filled a hunger, but reminded him that hunger was not always a thing to fear. That there was beauty in simple food and meaning in small acts. And as he stepped softly into the deeper quiet of the night, Bob carried with him the gentle truth that a piece of bread, a bowl of olives, and a whisper of cheese could be more than enough. There was always a moment after the meal, after the washing, when Bob would light a single candle and place it on the low table near his window. It was a plain candle, made of beeswax, with a short wick that leaned slightly to one side. He never trimmed it precisely. He liked how it burned unevenly, how the flame sometimes danced, sometimes stilled. The flickering light played gently along the stone walls, painting slow-moving shadows that climbed and curved, breathing softly like living things. It was not a bright light, not enough to read by, but enough to see the shape of evening settling in. Bob would sit near the candle, never too close. He didn't watch it with intent, didn't study the way it moved. Instead, he allowed it to enter his field of vision, like one might observe a small bird resting nearby present, yet unpossessed. The flame seemed to live its own quiet life. It bent when the air shifted, glowed golden when still, and leaned toward its own soft logic. Sometimes it trembled without reason, and other times it remained motionless, like a single breath held for minutes at a time. Watching it felt like watching time itself, slowed to the pace of breath and wax. The candle's glow created small pools of warmth in the otherwise shadowed room. Light clung to the corners of a book, the edge of a clay bowl, the curl of a dry fig leaf near the hearth. These gentle illuminations reminded Bob of dreams, partial, wandering, edged with meaning, but never quite graspable. He liked how the room changed under candlelight. Familiar objects became softer, rounder, quieter. There was something kind about the way darkness yielded to the flame, not with resistance, but with acceptance. The darkness didn't flee. It sat beside the light, sharing space. The candle burned slowly, its wax dripping in irregular patterns down the side. Bob never cleaned it while it burned. The mess was part of the beauty. He watched as the drips cooled into small ridges, like frozen rivulets on a hillside. Over time, they formed gentle curves and folds, collecting near the base like layers of time itself. Each evening's light added to the shape, building upon the last. It was never perfect, never the same. But to Bob, that was the point. Beauty lived in what changed gently, what left traces without needing to be remembered. He sometimes thought of the candle as a kind of clock, but not one that measured time with precision. It told time in its own way, through the rise of scent, the softening of wax, the slow fade of shadows. One could not be late or early by its measure. One could only be present. And in its company, Bob often lost track of everything else. He would sit still for long minutes, sometimes hours, watching the room dim, feeling the air cool, hearing only the occasional pop of the wick as it shifted. Time, in those moments, was not linear. It circled inward like a shell. Outside the window, the sky deepened to velvet. A few stars blinked into view, though Bob did not look directly at them. He could feel their presence beyond the edge of vision, just as he could sense the weight of the earth settling into sleep. The quiet around him grew fuller, not emptier. Candlelight held it gently, like a bowl holding water. The walls no longer reflected sound. The breeze had quieted. Even the old wood of the window frame seemed to hold its breath. In this stillness, the candle continued its slow dance, unbothered by anything beyond the room's soft boundary. Sometimes the flame would lean so far it seemed about to vanish, only to rise again, steady and tall. Bob found comfort in this small resilience. The candle didn't burn to impress, didn't shine brighter to prove anything. It simply offered what it had, and that was enough. It gave no heat except to its nearest surroundings, no light beyond the intimate circle it created. In this way, Bob felt it mirrored the soul, quiet, modest, flickering but persistent. Watching it, he felt less alone. Not because it was company, but because it reminded him how to simply be. He didn't need to think while the candle burned. Thoughts came and went like smoke. Sometimes he followed them for a moment, an old memory, a forgotten task, a curious idea, but they drifted quickly, softened by the silence. The candle seemed to absorb distraction, drawing it down into its small, steady heart. Bob rested in this head slightly tilted, hands resting on his lap, breath shallow but full. There was no goal in the moment, no purpose beyond witnessing the light. That was the secret of candlelight. It asked nothing, but gave everything, eventually. The candle would shorten, its wax nearly spent. The flame would begin to dip lower, its dance less playful, its glow more muted. Shadows would creep back into the room, quietly reclaiming their space. Bob would notice this without urgency. He wouldn't relight another. One candle was always enough. He let it burn until the last flicker, watching as the wick bent low, the flame shivered, and the final light folded inward like a sigh. The darkness returned not with harshness, but with softness like a thick blanket drawn over tired limbs. When the flame finally disappeared, Bob sat for a little while longer in the warmth that remained, not a warmth of fire, but of presence. The melted wax cooled on the table, and the scent of beeswax lingered faintly in the air. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dark. The world, now shadowed once more, felt no less alive. If anything, it breathed more clearly. And as Bob rose to fold the linen on the table and prepare for bed, he carried the quiet with him. The candle had gone out, but its peace remained, glowing softly in his chest like a small light that never asked to be seen. There was a particular stillness that arrived once the last candle had been extinguished. Bob moved slowly through the hush of his small stone house, each footstep soft against the floor that had held 1,000 evenings just like this. The cool air of night slipped in through the shuttered windows, brushing gently along his arms, reminding him that sleep was near. He folded the day behind him like a well-worn coat and made his way toward the bed tucked quietly into the corner. Of his room, a simple frame of wood, its presence more humble than grand, more faithful than forgotten Dot, the mattress gave slightly beneath his weight, sighing in that familiar way it always did, neither eager nor reluctant. Bob sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, letting the coolness rise through the linen sheets. The room was dark now, lit only by the faint suggestion of moonlight slipping between the shutters. He reached for the topmost blanket woven of soft, undyed wool and unfolded it over his lap with care. It had a quiet scent of sun and age, something between dried herbs and warm stone. Its texture, coarse but forgiving, grounded him in the present like no other thing could. He leaned back and lifted his legs gently onto the mattress, his movements slow and considerate, as though sleep itself were something fragile not to be. Startled, with practiced ease, he drew the heavier blanket, an old, thick quilt over his body, feeling its weight settle evenly across his chest and legs. The weight was not oppressive. It did not press down, but rather embraced. Like a river, stone warmed by the sun, it held a soft density that quieted every muscle. He breathed in deeply, the cool air meeting the warmth within the covers, and exhaled in slow rhythm, each breath an echo of the last. The quiet deepened around him. Outside, a fig leaf loosened from its branch and touched the ground without sound. The shutters creaked once, adjusting themselves against the night wind, then stilled again. Even the house, old as it was, seemed to sense the moment, its walls closing in just slightly, as if to keep him safe. Beneath the covers, Bob's hands found their place, one resting gently across his belly, the other tucked beneath his pillow. No need for words, no need for thought. His body knew this space, these layers of fabric, the precise way they wrapped around his limbs, like a lullaby woven in wool. The top blanket, a thinner cloth woven in blue and gray, held only the faintest warmth, but Bob liked it there. It was the first blanket he'd ever owned in the house, a gift from someone long forgotten, perhaps, or something he had traded for during one of those long-ago summers. Its edges were frayed, and a small tear in one corner had been mended with. Uneven stitches, a patch of darker thread standing out like a constellation. He ran his fingers gently across it in the dark. The texture reminded him that things didn't need to be perfect to offer comfort. They only needed to remain. Sleep did not come suddenly, nor was it chased. It arrived the way fog moves across a field first, as a suggestion, then a presence, then a certainty. Bob felt it approach from the edges, softening the corners of his mind, dimming the spaces between his thoughts. The weight of the blankets helped him let go. They anchored him without holding him down, coaxed him to loosen the grip of waking. Each layer added something, not just warmth, but rhythm, continuity. It was as if the blankets themselves remembered every night before and offered their memory back to him in silence. He listened not with his ears, but with his whole self to the sounds that lived beneath the silence. The faint creak of the wooden frame, the hush of fabric shifting with each breath, the low thrum of his own heartbeat buried deep under layers of cloth and time. There was no narrative to these sounds, no message, only reassurance. A soft, pulsing affirmation that the night was long, the world was still, and rest was near. He shifted slightly beneath the covers, not out of discomfort, but as a small gesture of belonging. This was his cocoon, this nest of woven memory and restful gravity. There were no dreams yet, only the promise of them. Shapes moved faintly behind. His closed eyelids clouds, perhaps, or leaves drifting down a quiet stream. The body began to forget the outlines of itself. His hands, so present a moment ago, faded into warmth. His feet no longer needed to be known. Even breath became a thing observed from a distance, like watching the wind move through distant trees. The blankets remained. They held everything he no longer had the strength to hold. They became the border between the world he left behind and the one he was slowly entering. Bob let go completely. The blankets accepted his weight, his quiet, his exhaustion, with the same indifference they offered every night. They did not ask how his day had been, did not remind him of what tomorrow might require. They offered no opinion, no resistance, only presence. The gentle weight of their fabric spread evenly across his chest, down his sides, around his ankles, calming every thought before it could become a sentence. Sleep was not far now. It hovered just above him, waiting for the last threads of wakefulness to dissolve in the dark. And so, within that small room of stone and memory, wrapped in a tangle of blankets both old and forgiving, Bob surrendered. To rest, the shutters whispered their final breath of the evening wind. The walls held the cool air close. And beneath the steady hush of night, the philosopher who no one remembered slept as though he had never needed to be remembered at all. His body warm, his thoughts stilled, his breath as quiet as the dust on the windowsill. Nothing more was needed. The blankets had him. The darkness accepted him. The day, at last, was over. Above the quiet outline of Bob's house, the sky stretched wide and deep, turning slowly into a velvet canopy as evening settled over the hills. A tiled roof, once warm with sun, began to release its heat into the cool of the night. It did. So without sound or fuss, surrendering to the rhythm of dusk like the surface of a still pond. One by one, stars appeared overhead, each one blinking into presence softly, with no need for attention. They seemed to have waited all day behind the brightness, resting in place until they were needed again to light the quiet hours. Through a narrow gap in the wooden shutter, Bob could see a sliver of that sky from his bed. It was a narrow frame, just enough to let the night in. And yet, through that small space, the stars arranged themselves in shapes beyond reason, no constellations he recognized, no stories he tried to remember. To Bob, the stars were not puzzles. They were simply there, present and still, glowing because it was in their nature to do so. He welcomed them with quiet eyes, letting their pale shimmer ease through the room like soft wind across a table. Of loose papers, the roof sloped gently beneath the window, the clay tiles worn and uneven with time. In the light of day, they showed their age-chipped edges, darkened corners, little mosses growing where rain once lingered. But now, under the soft light of distant stars, the roof appeared timeless. It held no flaws, only stories. Bob remembered, sitting on it in his youth, legs crossed, eyes toward the sky. The surface beneath him had always felt strong, trustworthy, familiar. He did not long to return to it tonight. Memory was enough. Presence, softened by age, was more than enough. A night breeze wandered in, cool and steady, carrying with it the delicate scent of rosemary from the garden and the earthy trace of fig bark and stone. It moved through the wooden frame of the house, like an old friend who knew every corner. Bob welcomed the air without stirring. He breathed in slowly, deeply, allowing the scent and silence to fill his chest. The stars blinked on above him, not moving but alive. Their silence was not empty. It was whole. It held time and distance, space and patience, in a way words never could. He lay still, watching, listening. He was not thinking of the day, not of the garden, nor his books, nor his meals. But thoughts still came, the kind that arrive without being asked. Gentle thoughts. He imagined the stars had watched this house, long before he lived in it, watched the same roof when it was first laid, the same garden before it grew full, watched others perhaps, resting beneath different blankets, listening to the same wind. The sky had always been there, unchanged. And in that constancy, Bob felt comfort. There was a beauty in not being the first or the last to be seen by the stars. Sleep did not come suddenly. It folded over him slowly, like the closing of heavy curtains in a quiet room. He did not resist it. He did not chase it. It arrived of its own accord, wrapping his thoughts in soft silence. His limbs, beneath the woven wool of his covers, were warm and still. He was not a man falling asleep, but a man being carried to sleep, carried by the hush of the night, the weight of the blankets, the roof above, and the distant, watchful stars. In this letting go, he felt whole, not separate from the world, but gently a part of it. The stars above continued to multiply. Tiny lights flickered into place, each one silent and self-contained. There were no leaders among them, no single star more important than another. Each one simply existed, glowing without urgency. Bob's eyes, half closed now, still sensed their presence. Even without sight, he knew they remained above him, steadfast, loyal, unchanging. Their light had traveled centuries, crossing time, to rest on a tiled roof over a sleeping man who asked for nothing. He liked to believe that was enough, that their presence alone was their gift. The roof had cooled fully by now, its surface no longer giving off heat, but instead reflecting back the quiet light of night. The clay, weathered and aged, had settled into its own stillness. Beneath it, the house held its breath. No birds moved. No fig leaves stirred. Even the branches seemed to sleep. The garden was silent, wrapped in the soft weight of the hours after dusk. Bob's breath matched this rhythm, slow, even peaceful. He was not listening for anything. He was not waiting. He simply let the world continue without him for a while. He shifted gently under his blankets, not out of need, but as a final motion, before surrendering to rest. The fabric against his skin was familiar, grounding. The stars above flickered faintly, not fading, but folding deeper into the night's embrace. Their light no longer called to him. It simply lingered, resting across the surface of the roof, the wall, the shutter, his closed eyelids. Bob did not need to remember this moment, nor carry it with him. It would remain, whether he did or not. The sky did not require witness. It only required stillness. And so, beneath the stars over the tiled roof, Bob gave himself fully to sleep. No more thoughts, no more breath held for meaning. Just the cool night, the gentle weight of stone and wool, the hush of the garden, and the ancient sky above unchanging, undemanding, entirely enough. A forgotten philosopher, remembered not in books or tales, but by the silence of the stars that never needed to speak. He was not alone. He was simply part of the night now, resting, beneath a roof that knew him well, and a sky that never once forgot his name. The hour had grown late, though time no longer mattered. In Bob's home, night didn't arrive with clocks or chimes. It arrived with stillness, with the hush of air through shutters, and the soft sighs of stones cooling under the moon. The last breath of the world outside folded in on itself like the last ripple on a pond. Inside, the weight of the day had already dissolved. There was no list of thoughts to unwind, no final act to perform. Just the quiet that came when everything had said what it needed to say, without speaking at all. The old house seemed to lean inward now, as if listening to Bob's breath. The walls held his sleep the way a shell holds a secret completely, gently. The room was dark, but not empty. It cradled the echo of books read and pages turned, of water poured and tea sipped, of footsteps taken in rhythm with thought. Each of those moments lingered invisibly, like dust motes resting in silence. And Bob, buried beneath layers of wool and memory, had let go of the world, not because he was tired of it, but because he trusted it would keep spinning without him. For a little while, outside, the tiled roof bore the weight of starlight, a silent guardian watching the slumbering home beneath. The garden no longer rustled. Even the olive trees stood still. The air had cooled completely, but beneath the blankets, Bob was warm, his body forgotten by his mind surrendered to something deeper. There was nothing left to do, no motion left to make. He had folded the day gently behind him, as he always did, and now let the night hold him as one holds a sleeping bird, without asking it to wake, without needing it to move. In the quiet house, only the smallest sounds remained, the sigh of the mattress, the whisper of wool adjusting, as breath rose and fell. These were not interruptions, but companions, the kind of sounds that hold the silence in place, like small stitches that keep the quilt from slipping away. And Bob, who had spent a lifetime doing things slowly, gently, meaningfully, now did the slowest thing of all. He slept, not like one escaping, but like one returning, not closing his eyes against the world, but opening something inward toward rest. He had always believed in the value of unnoticed things. A single stone placed beside another, a cracked teacup, a folded page, a candle that burned just long enough. None of it needed witness to matter. And so, as his breathing grew deeper, his body heavier, his thoughts lighter, there was no audience to his sleep but the quiet and perhaps the stars. It was enough. He had made peace not by seeking it, but by living inside it day after day, breath after breath. Sleep was not a destination, but the last sentence in a letter never meant to be sent. The bed, old as it was, had learned to welcome him. It creaked only once, as if confirming his presence, and then held its breath with him. The blankets did not shift. The night did not press. All remained as it was, as it had always been. The world outside his home could have vanished, and Bob would not have noticed. For in this moment, the universe had narrowed to the size of a room, the shape of a sleeping man, and the echo of footsteps long faded. And in that echo was no sorrow, only softness. No absence, only peace. Perhaps the world would forget Bob, as it already had. Perhaps his name would never be carved in stone, his thoughts never bound in a book. But he had lived. He had walked and watched, brewed tea and tended vines, folded laundry, and listened to wind. His life was not in the telling, but in the doing. And now, with the day done and the sky vast above, he surrendered to the same simplicity that had guided every morning, every evening, to rest when it was time and to do so without resistance. Window remained slightly open, just wide enough for the night air to drift through. It touched his cheek like a kiss from something timeless. Outside, no one passed. No lanterns flickered. No voices rose. The world had accepted his silence and offered its own in return. The tiled roof above him bore not only the weight of stars, but the hush of a life quietly lived, day after day, with nothing left behind but peace. And peace, as he knew, was more than enough. And so it was that the forgotten philosopher, whose thoughts had once danced among fig trees and beneath candlelight, now lay in a house so quiet it could hold a dream. There was nothing left to become. There was only being wrapped in sleep, in warmth, in stillness. A life unwritten, but well lived. A mind full of gentle echoes, now fading softly, like smoke from a long-cooled flame. The wind has quieted now. The fig leaves rest. A single candle flickers, then goes out, leaving only the faint scent of warm wax and olive oil behind. Bob has finished his tea, written his final thoughts in a worn notebook, and folded his blanket just so. The stars blink above the tiled roof, unconcerned by time or memory. In this stillness, the forgotten philosopher closes his eyes, not with regret, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of one who lived as gently as the world allowed. May you, too, find such peace. May your blankets be soft, your thoughts quiet, and your sleep deep. Let go of the day now. There's nothing left to do. Just breathe. Just be. Good night and sleep well, dear listener. We'll see you again soon.